Welcome to my site, everybody. My name is Paul Smyers. I'm a practicing real estate agent in the beautiful Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and I specialize in rural property. And one of my favorite subjects, and maybe dear to all of our hearts, is the cost of housing. Housing costs is a huge chunk of almost everybody's budget, and of course, we absolutely need some kind of housing. And there's so many problems in many parts of the world where people don't have the right housing. So there's always this question about how can we actually get inexpensive, low-cost housing. And because of my own personal experience and people I've known, I've even known some people who for a while did not even have a housing, and I knew someone who actually lived in a tent for 2 years and went to work and finally saved up enough money. So the subject of housing costs is so important, and bear with me a little bit. I'll go into a little bit of background information and some history. If you travel around the world a little bit, anywhere, you can just go online and just see pictures of other places of the world. There are people who live in the most strangest types of residences. You're talking about yurts, you're talking about huts, you're talking about river things on stilts, you got about cabins and tree huts, and oh my, there's so many ways that people have lived in inexpensive housing. And our ancestors, we got here because people lived, somehow they did it, caves or whatever, we got here. So the unfortunate thing is that housing is so important to all of us, but little by little, different factors involved in the property and so on, and having a chance to have a house and so on. And little by little, it's become like so difficult for people to just get a decent house. And next thing you know, there are people in some countries, they live in these little boxes in the sky, and some of them are 100 stories tall. I can't imagine how people would even live there. But here we are in this age, and so this is a very important subject. Now, however it developed, it just so happens that now we are in our modern age, the way land has been surveyed and all the different regulations have come in. If you really want inexpensive housing, you need to live in a rural area because the taxes are lower, the prices are lower, and you have an easier lifestyle. You don't have to pay so much for commuting if you can work out in a rural area. So there's a lot of really great advantages economically of living out in the country. But one thing that we have to have, if you want to live in one of these alternatives I have on my list here, you need to have the right zoning. And it just so happens that there are many parts of our country that were settled long ago by people just like you and me who want to go out and live in a rural area, and they want to have some freedom with their land. So there are a lot of areas in this country where there's very liberal zoning. You won't find that in a typical suburb or a cul-de-sac type of place or in a downtown area. You're going to have like all kinds of rules in those kind of properties. But if you get out in the countryside, the old style way of living, you'll find that you can end up having a pretty trouble-free, low-stress type of life at a much lower cost. Now, there are some drawbacks, and then there's some approaches, because this problem of low-cost housing came into America after the World Wars in the 1940s. This house is in 1946 that I'm in. After the war, people came back from the war, and there's a lot of trauma and a lot of materials have been, squandered on the wars and so on. So what happened was people just decided, well, we got to have a place to live, and one thing that happened was they developed what they called a mobile home. Everybody makes a joke about the mobile homes, but for a long time in the 40s, 50s, they didn't have a lot of money, and there was a lot of open land and open zoning, and a lot of people who went to war, they came back from the war, and they lived in a rural area to begin with. So they had a lot of mobile homes that were built in especially the 50s, 60s. Now, I've seen some of these homes from the 60s, the mobile homes, and frankly, I also see some that are rotting away in different parts of the woods, whatever, and nobody wants to talk about it, but people who live around there know that there's that thing up there on their old road, the old logging road, just sitting there decaying. But mobile homes still retained a strong value in even today. There are people who live in rather new model mobile homes. They call them mobile. They're not really mobile anymore, but they have wheels and they take them off as soon as they plant them somewhere. But the old style mobile home was just basically a trailer that you just hauled somewhere, and technically it was mobile, but it was pretty long, so people just kind of left it there. And you'd find these things around lakes and cabins and hunting cabins, and people would drag this thing up in the woods somewhere and park it, and then have a little cabin. Now, that was the old style of inexpensive living, and there's still a lot of those around in the country, parked on different places. And I know in Virginia, I see some mobile homes on some pretty nice land, honestly. The envy of any builder now, a beautiful view, and maybe some farmland next to them, and a piece of cake, but it's just a mobile home. So, getting back to the subject of mobile homes as far as the economic aspect of low cost housing. Now, back to the zoning. If you buy a piece of land and just it's zoned right. Let's say you buy a piece of property that's got a little access to a road, and maybe even if it might even have an easement up the road, but it's a decent piece of land. Let's call it like 5 acres, and it's zoned right. Technically speaking, you could probably put a tree house, a camper there, whatever, a tent, just live there, make a little bush hut or something, and technically you could live there very inexpensively. Now, most people aren't that rustic, and they don't want to do that, but there are a number of degrees of that. You can build a solid cabin, like a log cabin or something like that, and that might work. Now, there's some neat developments now that a lot of people may not be aware of that are actually quite more substantial in terms of a home, and one of them is called a yurt. The Mongolian people live, and some of them still do, in these amazing things they call a yurt. It's just basically a dome, and it has this fence that it's kind of like this accordion-like perimeter that they just fold it up after the winter. They move around because of the weather, and they have ways of setting this thing up. And now there are manufacturers in many parts of the world. I know there's one right here in Virginia called Blue Ridge Yurts, and they make these yurt things that, technically speaking, they are a non-permanent structure. So in many cases, they'll be lower tax, and they're very economical to be put up, and people use them for Airbnbs. I mean, I've seen some yurts that you walk inside like, wow, that's beautiful, man. What a beautiful vacation place that is. But they're round, and they have some features about them that may not be, they're a little awkward in some ways because they're all round, but you can also get people who connect 2 or 3 yurts. Like if you have an 18 diameter yurt, and then you have another one that's a 30-foot yurt, and then you have another one, then you can have a chamber, that or a little tunnel that goes through, connects to each one, or something like that. Or you can use a yurt for a garage kind of thing. So there are a lot of different creative ways to use what they call a temporary structure. Now, then that brings up the subject of mobile homes, the tiny homes. A tiny home is a big fad these days. You see some of them I see like, wow, that's so big. It's like, it's not really tiny anymore, but they make them anyway. They're like, sometimes they're $60,000, $70,000. But anyway, they have these things now they can put on a trailer, and the zoning is very different in many parts. So you really have to check where you're going to move one of these things. But technically speaking, in most areas that I know about Virginia, if you have the right kind of zoning on your land, you can park one of those things, a tiny home, and make yourself a little outhouse. Now that brings up the subject of a few things that we got to remember when you live out wherever you live. Okay, there's the water that needs to come in, and the rest that goes out. So I saw a mobile home, basically it was a camper, a 25-foot camper on some land one time, and they had lived there for 10 years, and their septic system was like 255-gallon drums below the camper, and they just, somehow it worked, for 10 years. They had 2 kids, and they lived there. But there are ways that you can improvise. I mean, people have lived in the woods for a long, long time, so there are ways that they did that. Now, there are outhouses that are pretty well built, and they have a light on in anything like a vent or something. But then there's the outhouses that, what I'm talking about. They summer camp, they go there. You're lucky if you come out without a possum. But anyway, there's a lot of creative ways that you can deal with that aspect of living. Now, as far as the water, people have springs sometimes. If you have a spring on your property, you can get clean water. Maybe you filter it a little bit or maybe boil it for drinking. But we're talking about the cheapest way to live now. I'm not saying that it's recommended for everybody, but if you really want to go on a scale from how cheap can you live, I see people living on the streets in Washington, D.C. if I ever go up there now and then, but you see that in some cities there are people who they have a tent in some park in the middle of the city. Now, I certainly won't recommend that, but you can, if you don't mind living in a tent, why don't you get some country land where you have like a whole acre for yourself and a lot of freedom, and maybe you can catch a mouse or like a rabbit now and then and have some food as well. But being a little serious here, the subject of housing is so important, and there are a lot of new technologies out there that are coming into play. A lot of these are type of structures that are like pod homes and so on now, container homes. But again, back to the zoning, you be careful where you put something like that, because there are a lot of people that may not, like if you buy like a vacant lot in a nice suburb with a cul-de-sac and you put your pod there that looks like a UFO, that you'll probably get a knock on your door like, excuse me, but we don't like the size of your house or the shape of it or whatever. But go out in the countryside and look around. Do some research. It's very different out in many parts of the country. There's different kinds of zoning. So I seriously recommend that you look into specifically where you want to move. But once you decide in that area, start looking into what the options are legally for having some kind of temporary or low cost type of housing. Now, brings back a couple important things about whatever house you buy. Part of the cost is your fixed cost, the price that you pay for it, and so on. The other kind is the operational cost. How much does it cost to heat it, etc.? Maintain it. Is it a simple, easy to maintain type of house, or does it cause a lot of problems? Are there too many trees on a property that'll fall down and break it or something? So maintenance of your property is another part of the equation, but a lot of people are very creative now, and look at our ancestors. I love to look at old pictures of old log homes and the way they built their fencing. They would just take the cedar logs and make all these creative types of fencing. Look at pictures from around the world and get some ideas of what constitutes low-cost housing. Because, like I said, the zoning, if you're in the right zoning, a lot of times a yurt, for example, is perfectly okay. Even when a camper, where you park that for a while in, like a 20-foot camper trailer. So just be careful about where you decide to buy property and the zoning and everything. But you can be very creative now, and a lot of people are looking into what can we do about low-cost housing. Lots of people need homes, but we can't afford, or if the average price of a home is $250,000 or $300,000. There are a lot of people, like I have children in their 40s, and there's a lot of people like myself who have children or grandchildren that are struggling with the cost of housing. So once again, to kind of summarize, you can find a lot better cost of living in the rural areas. And nowadays, with the technology, you can work in a rural area very easily now, or certainly commute to a town not too far away where you have a job and then come home. So I appreciate people listening. This is a very big subject about low-cost housing. It means a lot to me personally, and it's a very big subject. So any questions, ask me. I always watch other people's content, especially I've been watching a lot about these smaller kinds of homes and yurts and so on to help educate myself about the options. But sometimes if you start a little homestead with a little yurt or something like that on a couple acres of property, then as the years go by, maybe you'll buy something else, and then you can rent that out for Airbnb and get all your money back and make some profit. So I appreciate people listening. I watch a lot of other content, as I said, and I do read comments. I try to respond, and I always love the feedback. And please like and share if you enjoy the content. Thanks.